Hello. We are so glad to have you here. Welcome to episode 1 of the San Antonio Public Library and Developing Cultural Dialogue series, Sit With It, a toolkit for having tough talks. Episode 1 is going to cover issues of race and ethnicity in San Antonio. So, to begin with, we'll just let you know a little bit about what it is that we're going to be talking about today. We'll start off with introductions. First, Vanessa Martinez will introduce herself, and then I will introduce myself. I'm Dr. Miriam Sobre. After this, we're going to have some discussion questions. And so we are asking that everybody who is taking part in this session has something to write on and something to write with. So either a pad and a pencil or a tablet, your phone, note-taking app, anything you want. But please do make sure that you've got something to write on and something to write with, because there's going to be points where we're going to ask you to write things down. Then I'll talk a little bit about the purpose of the episode and define some of the terminology that we will be using. Then we're going to have another short free writing activity. Then Vanessa Martinez will be talking about the history and sociology of race and ethnicity here in our city, San Antonio. And finally, there will be a reflection activity and a conclusion that will ask you to take what you have learned in this session and figure out what you can do with this in your life, how this can have an impact in your interactions. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started with our introductions. Please meet Vanessa Martinez.
Hi, I'm Vanessa Martinez. I am currently the Human Resources Manager for the Levy Company, but I am also a bit of an activist and a small business owner. So I own 2 small Southside businesses, and I've also worked with Planned Parenthood to promote healthcare access for women in San Antonio. On the board of the Lilith Fund for Reproductive Equity, which helps ensure that Texans that need funds for abortions are able to get those funds. And I also currently am the commissioner for District 3 on the Mayor's Commission on the Status of Women, as a group that works on ensuring equity in health and entrepreneurship for women throughout San Antonio, and to reduce domestic violence. All of these things are in some ways related to social justice. And so that's why I felt that it was important to be a part of this today. I am a light-skinned Latina, and I go by she and her.
And thank you so much for joining our session. My name is Dr. Miriam Sobre, and I will be one of the people who's running the session today. I have a PhD in intercultural communication from Arizona State University, a master's in language and culture from UT Austin, and a BA from University of Puget Sound in English. And I teach at UTSA currently. I'm a lecturer and I teach intercultural communication. I have done probably 11 or 12 articles on various intercultural topics, including white privilege, Latino identities, race and ethnicity. I published a book on global citizenship, and I am currently working on another book on Jewish identity and intersectionality in the United States right now. I am also a single mom to a wonderful toddler who I'm hoping isn't hearing me do this, because she's going to start hollering when she does. And I'm also a dog mom to the lovely Grover. I am cisgendered, female, and I prefer she, her, and hers pronouns. I'm looking forward to talking to all of y'all today and continuing this conversation in the future. Thanks. All right, so now that you know a little bit about us, we have put this particular episode together as part of developing cultural dialogue, and we've been working with our 2 other colleagues, Jake Ernie and Aliana Castro. And so now that y'all have gotten a little bit of information about who we are, we can start to talk a little bit about why we're here and what it is that we're going to be talking about today. So there's several reasons that you guys might have chosen to take part in this kind of session with San Antonio Public Library. There are certain things like objectives that we hope to accomplish over the course of the next 50 minutes or so. So the first thing is we want to learn how to talk about things that we might find uncomfortable and taboo. So what that means is the issue of race, particularly if you have been raised in a predominantly white culture, has probably been taught to you as something that is uncomfortable to talk about, or indeed something that you shouldn't actually talk about. So one of the issues that happens with race is, particularly when you're raised by a dominant culture, such as being raised in the white culture, you're told that to ask other people what race they are, or to describe their race to you in a conversation, or to bring up somebody's racial identity is actually rude. And so we're taught not to do that. And today we're going to talk about, first off, why it is that those things are positioned as being uncomfortable or taboo. And second, a little bit on how to break those taboos. So we're entering into kind of a new era here in the United States and here in San Antonio, especially with all of the Black Lives Matter stuff that's been resurging during our time of COVID. And so we definitely need to revisit some topics and questions and ideas of things that we used to consider highly uncomfortable. Another objective is to understand terms like race and ethnicity. These terms are often vague. They have multiple definitions, and some people think they're interchangeable, some people think they aren't. So we're going to actually face those terms head on. We're also going to address how culture impacts and influences all of us, and in particular, how culture and bias are influencing every single one of us. There is nobody in the world really who isn't influenced by culture, and there is nobody who doesn't experience personal bias. That is, we are all have biases towards other people, but also other people are biased towards us. Now, one of the ways that this becomes what it is because of the place that we were raised. And so we're going to specifically look at how race and culture have been woven into San Antonio's history. And then finally, we are going to just begin by leaving everyone with some ideas on what to do with all of this information. So let's get started. We're going to start off with a short activity. As I mentioned before, you have all been asked to bring paper and a writing utensil, or at least a writing instrument and surface. If you have these, please feel free to respond to the following questions simply by brainstorming and then writing down your thoughts. Now, no one will ever ask you to say what you have written down on your paper, so this is entirely for you, so please be honest. Also, we want to emphasize the idea of brainstorming, which means you shouldn't try to judge your thoughts when they come up to you. As your thoughts come out, just write them down. Do not worry about what they are. Just free write them, all right? So that's the idea of brainstorming. You're not stopping yourself by saying, I shouldn't write that. You should write down anything that pops into your mind. With that in mind, there are no right or wrong answers. So please write whatever it is that you feel as you hear the question. So our first set of questions are dealing with issues of the relationship between being Latino and being white. So the reason that we're asking these kinds of questions is because San Antonio is a unique city and that it has a majority Latino population, which is unusual. And that population has been living in San Antonio for a very long period of time. So to begin with, we would like to know what you think about the following question. Why are Latina/Os considered white as a race? And I just want to make a note here. We're using the term Latina/O. I will explain why we've chosen to use this term when we define our terms. So there's a number of different kinds of terminology that can be applied here, but here particularly we want to focus on the term Latina/O. So why are Latinas/O considered white as a race? The next question is asking you, what race do you consider yourself? What is the first word that pops into your head, or the first set of words, when we ask you, how do you define your own race? And finally, we would like to know why you consider yourself to be this race. So whatever word or words you wrote down, take a couple of moments and think about what made you write down these words, and then write down the response to that. Please remember there are absolutely no right or wrong answers, and you are not going to have to share these. So please write down what you feel honestly. Okay, let's move on to the second set of questions. What are the similarities and differences of words used to describe race? And I'm going to provide y'all with some prompts or examples of what these words are. Okay, so what do you think of when you hear the following set of words? The first set is Latino, Hispanic, Chicano. The second is white, Caucasian, and Anglo. So just write down, what do those words make you think of? I also want to note here, you can separate the words out if you would like and define each one of them, or you can just talk about what the words in general get you to think of. And remember, no right or wrong answers. All right, here are the final set of questions for this first activity. What is race? Remember, there are no right or wrong answers, so write down the definition that you can think of when you hear the word race in your head. Now, please answer the following question. What is ethnicity? Do the same thing. Write down the definition that you have in your head, or what that word makes you think of. The final question is, what are the differences and similarities between these terms to you? So when you hear the term race and when you hear the term ethnicity, what do they have in common and how are they different? Okay, now we're going to go through and actually have a little bit of a lecture and give you some information from some scholars and theorists about what these different terms mean. All of the terms we're going to be discussing have to do with the concepts of race and ethnicity. We're dividing them up by specific types of race and ethnicity. And we will start with Latina/O. So the first slide is, or the first question is, sorry, the first topic is, we'll start with a quote. Latina/Os are not exempt from the oppression of white supremacy. Yet as a group, we are often seduced into thinking that we are white. This quote was by Crucius Haynes, who is a scholar of Latino issues in the legal world. So let's unpack this a little bit. To begin with, People who identify themselves as Latino or Hispanic can be considered of any race or color. So the idea that Latino or Hispanic designates a certain kind of skin color or a certain racial identity is false, right? So these you can appear black and be Latino or Hispanic. You can appear white and be Latino or Hispanic. You can appear Asian or indigenous and identify as Latino or Hispanic. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the terminology of Latino. You'll notice that we have been using the term Latina/O and interchangeably using that term with Latino. So all of these words, Latino, Latina/O, Latinat, and Latinx, are all terms that are rooted in the word Latino Americano, which is a word that describes people who are geographically from Latin America and who now live in the United States. The choice to move between Latino, Latina/O, Latinat, and Latinx, these are choices and versions of these words that have come along as gender identifications have become more important. So it used to be that we would use the term Latino to describe every person who identified as this, regardless of their gender. But then women would, as we should, probably started to get a bit frustrated with this and asked to be represented as well. So then we came up with the idea, or theorists came up with the idea of calling it Latina/O, so that allows for women and men. That was abbreviated into Latinat because the at kind of looks like an O and kind of looks like an A. Now the term that is most often used, and the term that I believe San Antonio Public Library uses, is Latinx. Latinx is a term that is designed to include all gender identifications, not just male or female. But beyond that, all of these terms are just derivatives of the word Latino Americano. Now, while Latino is a geographical distinction, Hispanic is a linguistic designation. So this is a designation for people who come from Spanish-speaking countries, and they now can live in the United States, but they don't have to live in the United States. So an example that might help clarify the difference between Latino and Hispanic is that someone from Brazil, where they speak Portuguese, would be considered to be Latina/O because they are from Latin America, but not Hispanic because they're not from a Spanish-speaking country. Alternatively, someone from Spain might be considered Hispanic, as Spain is a Spanish-speaking country, but not Latina/O because they are not from Latin America, they're from Europe. All right, so that's kind of the way to make that distinction. Now, while Latino and Hispanic are words that are both used to describe this group by both its own members, so people who identify as Latina or Hispanic might call themselves one or both of those terms. They are also terms that are sometimes given to that group by out-group members. So say, for example, on the census or in news reporting or in the media, people who do not identify as Latina/O or as Hispanic may still call that group of people that term. Alternatively, the word Chicano is a chosen identity. This is a purposeful, strategic term that are used only by members of that group to define themselves, someone who is indigenous to Mexico but lives in the United States. There's also a lot of political connotations to this term, but unfortunately, we're not going to have the time to go into those right now. Okay, so we've talked about Latino, Hispanic, Chicano. Now let's talk a little bit about whiteness. What does it mean to be white? So Martin Nakayama and Tom Krizik, in a land-breaking study, in a communication study that was done in the late 90s, say this quote: "In United States culture, whiteness has assumed the position of an uninterrogated space. In some, we don't know what whiteness means." So this is particularly important. Whiteness is generally defined by the absence of, rather than the presence of, culture. To be white is kind of to have a generic European background in cultural or ethnic origin, but specific ethnic ties are not generally given. So the idea is that oftentimes when people describe themselves as white, they also describe themselves as not really having a culture, being culture free, or being a European mutt in a sense, right? So even people like Mediterranean Europeans, like Greeks, Turks, even and Southern Europeans like Italians, and then Eastern Europeans like Slavs and Russians and folks who identify as Jewish may have more of an ethnic identity on top of their whiteness, but because they have a presence of other ethnic ties, they're not considered necessarily as white as the general white person who doesn't know where their family comes from. So this is interesting. Now, within this area, there's a couple of other terms that are used. Anglo, similar to Hispanic, is a linguistic designation, and it means somebody who speaks English and lives somewhere in the Americas. So that's North, South, or Central, or Latin American, right? So that's Anglo. Caucasian, similarly to Latino, is a geographical designation. It used to mean people who originated in the Caucasus region of southern Russia. But probably because it sounds like a complex term, it has changed to mean a descriptive term that equates white and European that is often used in things like police reports, census data, and scientific studies. However, Caucasian, Anglo, and white all kind of mean the same thing. Now, there is also the important term of white privilege. White privilege comes from the assumed unearned position at the center or the top of the system that white people are given in the United States in particular, and in other parts of the world that vary by location. So it's the idea that if you are born white in the United States, you are automatically granted some privileges, such as not have to be so worried when you get pulled over by a police officer, or maybe not being punished as a troublemaker in school, that are things that you didn't ask for, you just get them based on your appearance, okay? So now that we've talked about Latino identities and whiteness, let's talk a little bit about Blackness. So a quote by Mark Orby and Tina Harris from their book Interracial Communication states, "Unlike many other countries, the United States has historically embraced a one-drop rule, whereby a single drop of Black blood makes a person Black." The issue of whether a person who is Black lives in the United States is very important because of the United States history of systemic slavery. So although by no means all, a lot of Black folks who live in the United States, and most who have lived here for a long period of time, at some point in their family's history were either brought over to the United States against their will as slaves or sold into slavery while living in the United States. So that is very important when you're looking at your terminology. Historically, terminology describing this group of people has shifted in the US throughout the second half of the 20th century, after World War II, beginning in the Civil Rights Movement and moving forward from there. Before World War II and the Civil Rights Movement, the term colored was generally used to describe people who appeared Black. During the Civil Rights Movement and right after the war, the term Negro was often used to describe Black folks. Then the term Black was generally used, and finally, only in the latter part of the 20th century, the term African American became far more widely used. Now, today, the terms Black and African American are often used interchangeably by both in-group and out-group members. So several studies have shown that if you ask people who identify as Black or African American what they prefer to be called, a good portion say they can be called either, and about beyond that, there's a split that's about 50-50 between the people who want to be called Black and the people who want to be called African American. However, it is important to recognize that while Black people who self-identify or are identified as others as by others as Black live all over the world, African Americans only live in the United States. So there are no African Americans in Africa. There are no African Americans in Europe, right? Well, I mean, there are if there's somebody from the United States who identifies as African American, goes to live in Europe, but still maintains their American citizenship, sure. But you get my drift, right? In order to identify as African American, you must be Black and live in the United States. And this is because of the role of slavery that I described above. Why are these terms important? So why are we spending a lot of time breaking down these terms? They all sort of mean the same thing, but not quite, right? Now, it's important to actually recognize that words and language do matter. They're very, very important. So the designations or terms for Latino, white, and Black are not all equal. They are not on equal footing with one another. It is important, as I've stated already, that some of these terms are chosen by the group that they describe, while some are given or put upon the group by outsiders. It's also important to note that definitions have various vague differences, such as geography, national identity, and language. But those differences are random and arbitrary. They don't seem to be connected to one another in any way. So what I ask you from here is then, what do you like to be called? And is there anything that you dislike being called, and why? Now, the last set of terms that it's important for us to identify and understand as part of this little mini lecture are the actual things we're talking about. Race. It is very important that we recognize that race is a social construction of human differences used to classify humans into separate value-placed categories. When I say social construction, I mean this. While there are some scientific and genetic dispositions that group people close to each other with other people who are similar, there is really absolutely no way that you can completely group people together by race, because race was developed, really even the concept of race was developed by white European men in Europe during the Enlightenment. And it has shifted and changed in a way that has added value judgments to people who tend to have higher value based on how similar they are to white or light-skinned or even Scandinavian Europeans or Anglo-Europeans, and then how far they differentiate from that. And that can be based on appearance, it can be based on language, it can be based on kinship, it can be based on all different kinds of things. So it is socially constructed. That means these categories are weird and they change and shift all the time because they're just constructed by people in their interactions. Just because they are social constructions, though, does not mean that they are not very real categories and that the impacts of these real categories cannot be felt by the people who are discriminated against, who are members of categories. All right, so what's the difference between race and ethnicity? Ethnicity is a culture marker that indicates shared traditions, heritage, and ancestral heritage based on descent, where people come from. Ethnicity can also be considered a subcategory of one's race. So a person's race might be Asian American, general category, but their ethnicity is Korean, specific category, right? So I personally, Dr. Miriam Sebre, I identify as white and American. I would identify my race as white, but ethnically I identify as Jewish because that is where my family heritage derives from, right? And another interesting thing to note is that race is often a category that other people put on you, whereas ethnicity is generally, not always, but generally a category that we tend to claim for ourselves. Finally, the term culture. Culture can be seen as a learned and shared values, beliefs, and behaviors common to a particular group of people, a group identity that is forged and shared by a group of people. But it's important to recognize that while race is culture, culture is more than just one's race. So you might have a culture of African Americans, but African Americans have additional things to their cultural identities beyond their race of just being Black, right? Things like gender, things like age, socioeconomic status, religion, all of these things are part of culture. A couple of additional important terms to recognize. Ethnocentrism is a term that means when you perceive your own culture and your own cultural perspectives as normal, and everybody who is different from you is therefore abnormal or subnormal. Your way of looking at things is the right way, and everybody who doesn't agree with you is in the wrong, and there's something wrong with them. That's ethnocentrism. Prejudice is important to understand because we all stereotype, all human beings put people and ideas into boxes. It's the way that we make sense of the world. And it's okay to do because everybody does it. It's just part of your natural perception processes. However, prejudice is when you assign an inaccurate and negative belief to support the superiority of your group over another group. All right? That's prejudice. You're prejudging in a negative way. Discrimination is when you act upon those prejudices. So the second you say, you look like this has negative connotations to me, therefore you can't stay here and you must go. If I say that, I am engaging in an act of discrimination. However, while anybody can be ethnocentric, prejudiced, or can discriminate, racism can only happen when the people in power are doing this against the people who aren't in power. So racial prejudice plus societal power equals racism. This is the systemic subordination of certain racial groups by those groups in power. Non-dominant racial or ethnic groups cannot be racist because, according to this definition, because they are not in positions of power in the system. They can be ethnocentric, they can be prejudiced, and they can discriminate, but they cannot actually be racist. Okay, so next what we're going to do is another short activity. So you're going to need to get your paper and pencils or writing utensils and writing platforms out again. That's going to help us to integrate into our next section. So when I was previously talking about the differences between race and ethnicity and then ethnocentrism, prejudice, discrimination, and racism, it is important to recognize that the biases that we all experience and have all been judged on, that these biases don't necessarily come from only us, they often come from a wider system. So let's talk a little bit about being in San Antonio in particular. The first question that I have for you is, why do San Antonio Latina/Os often feel a sense of hierarchy over other POCs or people of color, particularly African Americans? Now remember, no one's going to read your answers, so you can be honest. The second question is, you may identify as Latino or Hispanic, you may not. You may identify as African American or Black, you may not. But what I want to know is, have you ever experienced these kinds of feelings on either end? So have you ever felt superior to somebody else because of your race or ethnicity? Or have you ever felt inferior to someone else because of your race and ethnicity? Has someone else ever made you feel worse because of your race and ethnicity? Now, the final question we have here is, where, if you have experienced this on either end, where do you think these ideas and feelings come from? It's important to remember, as I stated before, everybody has bias. No one is immune from feelings of bias towards people who are different from them. Multiple studies have shown that even small children tend to prefer spending time with other kids who look like them. This does not mean we're born racist. It just means that human beings tend to have a hard time with things that they can't predict or explain, that they're uncertain about. And if you see someone who looks and acts like you, then in your head, they seem more predictable and you can explain them better. They're more similar to you, so you tend to prefer those people on a subconscious level, right? We all experience this. Oftentimes, though, when we do experience this, we don't even realize it's happening. We do not realize that when we walk into a room, we choose to sit next to somebody who makes us feel safer. Like if it's a room full of strangers, we tend to sit next to somebody who subconsciously makes us feel safer, whereas somebody else might make us feel less safe. Just because you have these biases, and even when you subconsciously react to them, this does not make you a racist. We all have biases. We all stereotype. We all put people into categories. The reason we do this is because we do not have enough time in our days to get to know every single person we interact with on a deep level. And it takes generally getting to know somebody on a deep level to expel these ideas of biases. That's how you get rid of biases. You get to know somebody as a person. But we don't have time to do that, so we stereotype, and then we develop biases, and we may act on those. Now, the important thing to note here is that these biases, they don't generally come from deep inside us. They come from systemic, which means system-based influences, right? And these influences start hitting us. Think about when you have a baby, the first thing that happens with that baby is when they figure out the gender, they put a little pink hat or a little blue hat on the baby, right? So already we are being taught that boys and girls are different and that girls should be associated with pink while boys should be associated with blue. This is the idea of systemic bias, all right? So we are influenced by the media. The media is constantly telling us what to think about different racial and ethnic groups, right? Reality TV shows, fictional TV shows, movies are always giving us these ideas. That's a system. Urban sociology and structure. That is, where do you live in your city? What is your neighborhood like? Is it easy or hard to get to? What kinds of services are available in your neighborhood? Is your neighborhood generally safe? Is there a big police presence? Is the police presence because of public safety or because of crime, right? All of these things impact how we see race and ethnicity. And finally, how you're educated. Being born and raised here in San Antonio means you get a specific kind of education starting from elementary school or earlier that tells you about the history of Texas and the history of our city and why it was structured the way it was. And so even without realizing it, your teachers and your textbooks are teaching you how to feel how to feel bias, how to stereotype, and often how to feel ethnocentrism and discrimination. With that in mind, Vanessa Martinez is going to take over now and talk to us about the history of San Antonio, our beautiful, wonderful city, but how race has and feelings about and against various different groups has been developed into our city based on its construction, its development, and various other sociological factors.
In this section, we're going to review how Latinos and Latinas became part of the white race. Now, I am going to use Mexicans, Latinos, and Latinas, and possibly other terms, because those are the terms that were used at the point in time that we're going to be discussing these terms. So in the 1940s, Mexicans officially became categorized as part of the white race in the United States Census. But what is the historical origin of classifying Latino and Latinas in San Antonio as white? Going back to the mission period of San Antonio, Texas, we're introduced to the Spanish casta system. The Spanish system is a caste system, just like any other caste system, where there are levels of privilege. And in the casta system, Indigenous and Black people were marginalized. This is one of the early elements in San Antonio of darker skin being less than lighter skin. In 1848, the Treaty of Hidalgo gave Mexican territories to the United States, and this offered Mexicans the opportunity to be considered white. Once the Treaty of Hidalgo was signed, those that were Mexican citizens living in the United States territories were allowed to choose what nationality they wanted to become. They could become Mexican citizens, they could stay Mexican citizens, or they could become United States citizens. Once they were considered United States citizens, they were considered white. Many people chose this option because it gives them the property, the rights. It gave them the opportunity to own land or to own property, which was something that you would need to do in that time. Another instance where Mexicans and Latinas were fighting for the right to be white and to be included as citizens of the United States came in 1936 when LULAC fought for the rights fought for the removal of the Mexican race from the United States Census. LULAC asked that Mexicans and other Latinos and Latinas be classified as part of the white race, and this became an official practice in the 1940 census. Another piece of history that directly affected Texas was the decision in Hernandez versus Texas in 1954, where a Mexican man requested a jury of his peers, and in that decision of allowing Mexicans to become equal, Mexicans offhandedly equated themselves to whites. In addition to the historical elements of Latinos being represented or being considered whites, we've also got social issues that were affecting Latinos throughout the time in Texas. We'll think back to the days of the 1940s and 50s where Latino and Latina students were forced to speak English only in classrooms. This created a need for parents to teach their children English only, removing Spanish from future generations like myself in hopes of creating children that were more accepted. People also changed the pronunciations of their names to sound more white. We've got instances of celebrities, Rita Hayworth, Oscar Isaac, and Martin and Charlie Sheen. These are all people with Latino descent that chose to change their name to white. This is all too common in Latino representation on screen, as authors, and in many other forms.
Thank you so much for that information, Vanessa. That was so useful, and hopefully it helped to explain to some of our participants some things that you might not have known about our city in general and the really subtle ways that race and socioeconomic status and power all intersect with one another. So what we want to end with is we want to think, where do we go from here? So if you put it away, take back out that paper and pencil or writing utensil and platform one more time, and I am going to ask you to free write for 5 minutes on the following questions. Again, remember, there's no right or wrong answers, but do try to write this information down somewhere where you will be able to hold on to it and return to it, because after this session, the next day there will be episode 2, which is talking about these kinds of uncomfortable issues with your family and friends. Also, we will eventually be doing an interactive session where you can bring these ideas that you develop from your own private brainstorming session, or if you're watching it with a partner, you can, or your family, you can brainstorm with them as well, right? So write down these ideas somewhere where you can hold on to them, then you can bring them to our interactive session, and if you so choose, ask questions. So here are the final set of questions. What is one thing that you've learned from this session? What is one takeaway, one thing you learned that you didn't know before? Second, what is one way that you can change your behaviors or actions based on this session? One thing that you can do pragmatically in your life that can do something different in terms of the issues we cover in this session. Finally, what questions do you have about the issues we have discussed today? Any and all questions are welcome. There are no stupid questions, and there are no right or wrong questions. Just to help everybody, you can access this information. So if while you're waiting for the next episode or before you go to your interactive session, or just if you want to know more, we've included the scholarly references that we use to make this presentation, but we've also included a series of web resources, web links that you can copy and paste into your web browser to learn more about these kinds of issues, to find out different ways that these issues are treated in different areas and different types of media, et cetera, et cetera. So the web resources are resources that can help you to dig a little deeper. All right, thank you so much for attending our session. We really enjoyed putting this together for you all, and we really hope that we have given you some things to think about, some ideas that maybe you hadn't had before, and we really look forward to hearing your feedback, and we also look forward to seeing you for episode 2. Thank you so much, and everybody have an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.